So I'm continuing today Jared's series through the book of James that he calls Measured. And the passage that Jared selected for me that was kind of next in line, I think he cackled a little bit when he assigned it. He admitted it's a little bit of a downer because, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about how short our lives are and how we're all going to die. However, I think there's some hope and there's a lot of things about this passage that we can apply to our lives while we're still living. But just want to give you that heads up. I actually don't want to start by talking about my relationship with video games. So growing up, we were behind the times, and one of the examples of that is we got the gaming system, the GameCube, around the time they stopped making GameCube games, because all the cool kids had moved on to a different system by then. So I was never really knowledgeable on all things video games. However, being a resident director at a university where I'm engaging with college students on a day-to-day basis, I've actually learned a lot about video games. And one of those things is that people can actually make money doing this thing. They can play video games professionally. And there's a bunch of different ways that happens. But one of my students is a semi-professional gamer, and she streams her games. Other people watch her play games every once in a while. And sometimes this money that she earns actually just goes to charity. She does a lot of charity streaming. And she told me about an event she did recently that I do believe was for charity, but it had some kind of interesting rules. So she is playing some video game, and people are all watching her play, but they get the chance to influence her decisions. They pay a little bit of money and can tell her what choice should she make. Left, right, fight the monster, or flee? What is she going to do? People watch. She is technically the one playing the game, but everybody else is controlling all the decisions. I can imagine being incredibly stressful if I were in that situation. I like to be in control. I'm sure a lot of us have those similar kinds of feelings. It's awkward when somebody else is telling us what to do and we don't get a say. We like to kind of, do our own things. I think it's hardwired in most of us as humans. We don't really want other people telling us to do. We just kind of want to do our own thing. We want to make our own choices throughout life. We would much rather play the game all by ourselves and silence any of the other voices that try to tell us what to do. I think, though, we're a lot more confident in our abilities than we should be. So let's go to James. So far in James, James is this wisdom book. It has a lot of do's and don'ts. Don't be angry. Watch that tongue. There's a lot of content about here's how we should live and here's how we shouldn't live. And sometimes when we're reading literature like that, or really when we're just reading the Bible, we can get so caught up in here's the list of things we can't do and here's the list of things we can do. And our relationship with God becomes this list. But in this section that we're going to talk about today, in James chapter 4, verse 13 through 17, it's less so much of a list and more of an urging of what our lifestyle should be. New Testament scholar Douglas Moo calls the section from 4:13 to 5:11 implications of a Christian worldview. So if you buy into this Christian worldview thing, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, if you believe all that stuff, this is what it's going to look like in your day today. So the section we're going to talk about today, 4:13 through 17, is less practical do's and don'ts and is more a challenge for how are you going to live every single second of your short life on earth. It's an urging to be completely transformed by God. So let's dive in. Oh, wrong way. So James chapter 4, verse 13 through 17 says this: Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So James is describing kind of a typical example of a middle-class person in this period, a merchant. A merchant, in order to make a living, has to go from town to town, selling things. That's how they live their life. Like a lot of jobs in this time period, and today even, it's kind of unpredictable. There's not a guaranteed paycheck. So James uses the example of this person to critique a kind of thinking. There is the worldly kind of thinking that just focuses on the things I got to do day to day, day after day. In this case, a merchant who is just focused on making some money to get by. He critiques that because they ignore the spiritual reality. We are tempted to forget that we all have an expiration date. And unfortunately, it's not labeled on the box. We don't know when this life will end. We think we're invincible. We live sometimes as if God's existence doesn't matter for what I do in each and every moment. Verse 14 calls our lives a mist. And I think this is kind of a reference to the book of Ecclesiastes. Because if you open to the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll see this word repeated a lot. It might be translated meaningless or vanity in your version. But the author of Ecclesiastes tries to hammer again and again that everything is meaningless. But that word meaningless, or sometimes vanity, just means mist or a vapor. The idea here is everything is like a vapor. We can't fully grasp it. It just kind of disappears in thin air. It's not concrete. And so I think that is the image that James is picking up for us. That's what our lives are like. Because we fail to recognize the unpredictable nature of life and the shortness of life in the grand scheme of things, then what happens is we unintentionally sometimes adopt a boastful attitude. You know, we often think of boasting as kind of obvious pride, getting all puffed up and talking about all our achievements. But another form of boasting is just forgetting that everything we do is under God's sovereign control. That the blessings in our lives were not something that we did with our own hard work. All of that comes from God. Whenever I take center stage, then it follows that God is pushed off the stage. So James wants us to realize that the right thing to do, which if we fail to do is a sin, is to keep God top of mind throughout our lives. Failure to do this right thing means we've sinned. Even if we haven't, broken all 10 commandments, even if we haven't been like a bad person, it's sinful in a way to just forget that God is sovereign over every moment of our lives. So at the trouble of alienating the right-brained folks in the audience, I do want to do some math real quick. I started with video games, and now I want to get into the territory of math, which personally I try to avoid at all costs. But if you allow me, let's do some math. So, if we assume the average person spends about 3 hours in a church building a week, let's give you a 1-hour Bible class, 1-hour worship, and we'll throw in a 1 hour on Wednesday night just for good measure. If that is what the average church member is thinking about God, is doing something religious related, if that's when God is top of mind, then that means about 1.8% of your week is dedicated to God. If all you do that relates to God and faith and church and everything is just when you show up in a building 3 hours a week, 1.8% of each week is dedicated to God. Now compare that to the average work week, 40 hours. That is 67.2% of your week. Obviously, that takes up a lot more time. And I'm not saying we should be in church 40 hours a week. I'm not saying something like that the solution to this is to increase church attendance. But the idea of this math is just to remind us, if this is the only time we think about God, we're not really giving God very much of our daily lives. It can be really easy to focus on God only a few hours. Here at church, it's relatively easy to focus on God. That's all we're talking about. But when it comes to our average existence, when it comes to the demands of everyday living, it's too easy to forget that God matters, that God is somebody who cares about our lives and wants to be a part of this. It's easy to forget that God is involved in everything. Our overconfidence blinds us from the truth. And that truth is that we are not in a purely material world. If we were just in a material world, then yeah, by all means, just care about work. Just care about getting to the top. Just care about all that other stuff. But the truth is, we're not just in a material world. We are also in a spiritual world. There are things that matter beyond just what's here right in front of us and just what is physical and just what occupies our time. So everything we occupy ourselves with, from the bathroom breaks to the water cooler conversations to the agonizing decision of what should we make for dinner, all of that is only half the picture. The other half of the picture is that God is real and God cares about what we do in each moment. To live a measured and balanced life like we're talking about through the book of James means we have to recognize that the world is both material and spiritual. And overemphasizing the material is going to miss really what's the point of all of this. So the big question that nobody can answer but yourself is God a priority in your life? As the Ecclesiastes teacher says, life is vanity. It's a striving after the wind. It's kind of meaningless. And if you read Ecclesiastes, he goes through this search. What if I just work? Can I find meaning in that? What if I just go hedonistic and just get all the pleasures of the world? Does that give me meaning? He even tries wisdom. What if I know everything, and if I try to strive after all the learning and knowledge and the wisdom of the world? But all of those he finds lacking. And one of my favorite scriptures in the Bible is right at the end of Ecclesiastes, where the teacher's kind of summarizing, what did we learn today, kids? And in that section, in Ecclesiastes 12, 13 through 14, the teacher, who we often call Solomon, but the book technically doesn't say it's Solomon, says this: "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." If we just focused on everything that the physical world has to offer, that the material world has to offer, then we would miss legitimate fulfillment in our lives. Because there is meaning in our mist, in our vaporous life. There is meaning. It's just outside of this plane of existence. It's outside of this material world. Our meaning comes from God and from God only. So James tells us to live our life with God's will in mind, as if God cares about every second and every decision, because God does care about all those things. With the acknowledgement that we don't have a monopoly on our lives, that instead God does, then we can live as if God is the creator and sustainer of life. God is the Redeemer who offers us a chance to live beyond our mortal body. Whatever we need to do, whatever we need to be, is in the context of the Lord's will. Again, as James tells us in verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. The phrase really it reminds me of the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus demonstrates that prayer is not just about, here's a list of things I want, but also a list of, hey, I'm putting this stuff into your hands. As it says in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is the practice of a Christian life. The simple statement, if the Lord wills, is a reminder that nothing in life is guaranteed. God may take us home tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe 40 years down the road. But one thing is for sure, we should live as if God cares about each and every moment of our lives, because God does. It's arrogance to think we can just do all of this by ourselves, that every success or every mistake is something that God is totally uninterested in and God plays no part in. You know, we are passengers in life and God is our driver. For our lives are but a mist, a vapor, something relatively brief in the grand scheme of things. But we have an opportunity in this mist. We have an opportunity to glorify God in everything we do. What really strikes me as interesting is when James is critical of this merchant who has this attitude of, I'm just going to go town to town, I'm going to make a profit. His solution isn't, what are you doing in the business world? You need to go be a missionary. You need to go, plant a church. You need to go do X, Y, very specific religious Christian thing. No, his solution is, hey, keep doing that. Keep doing what you're doing in the world. But here's the difference. Make sure God is involved in that process. All he wants is whatever we do, whatever occupation we're in, whatever situations we find ourselves in life, just make those moments count for God. Just in the things that we already do. So if life is a video game, if we can imagine that metaphor for a moment, we come across a myriad of choices, forks in the road. Now, the temptation is to do which one we think is best because, we're smart cookies and all. But what James wants us to do, what God wants us to do, is to adopt an attitude that allows God to have a say in our actions. That no matter what the choice is, no matter where we find ourselves, that God is involved. Because let's not kid ourselves, to keep using this video game analogy, we don't have unlimited regenerations. We don't have multiple lives. We just got one. So how are we going to make this one count? What's truly going to matter is whether we lived our lives for ourselves or for God. So in our divided world, our response must be to bring God into the conversation 24/7. We cannot arrogantly think we can do this alone. James seems to call us to live a daily life with regard to God in everything we do. God must be top of mind. And to think about our death is kind of unpleasant. To think about that shortness of life, it's not really the kind of thing that, we necessarily like to hear preachers say on a Sunday morning. By the way, you're going to die. But that's a rich part of the Christian tradition. And even this Wednesday is actually Ash Wednesday, which millions of our brothers and sisters in different Christian traditions around the world will celebrate as the start of Lent, which is the 40 days before Easter. And on Ash Wednesday, they get a little ash cross on their forehead as a reminder that eventually we're going to turn into dust. Our lives are short. However, there is meaning here if we bring God into every moment. So pretty soon here, we're going to stand and sing. We're going to have a closing prayer from an elder, and then we're going to walk out that door. And we have a choice when we walk out that door. We have a choice to forget about God, to go on to our normal day, pretend like, okay, well, we checked this off our box, or we have the choice to say, Lord, if it is your will, we'll go to Ted's for lunch. We have an option, we have a choice to make God a part of everything we do or to not. Will God be embedded into your life? Will God be involved in all the opportunities in our midst of a life or not? That is the choice before us today. So on that happy note, let's stand and sing.